countdown, no music. We're just getting... I was delivered a book a few weeks ago that I couldn't put down when I started reading it, called Magnetic Stories. And I reached out to the author and said, I'd love to get you on Monday Night Live. She's like, I thought we're already booked in. And I realized that the stars must have been aligning, because my good friend Joris Quester had already introduced Gabrielle to Monday Night Live. And so here we are to talk about storytelling. Gabrielle's got a pretty outstanding repertoire of dealing with C-suite executives and helping them tell stories. She's worked with the Obama Foundation, name drop, boom. So everybody, please make Gabrielle feel extremely welcome to Monday Night Live. And just quickly, I'll get you as well to drop in the chat and say hello and let us know exactly what city you're tuning in from. Let us know where in the world you are tuning in from tonight. Gabrielle, welcome.
Thanks, Nathaniel. It's really good to be here. And yes, I was excited that we were already booked in, and then you reached out and said, hey, could you come on my podcast? I go, already sorted.
Yeah, I was fascinated. It's a really good read. And I see that you've written a number of these storytelling books. But you seem to have more to say on the topic. I guess it's a topic which is becoming more popular, isn't it, in the corporate world?
Yeah, it is. Look, I started doing this over 16 years ago, and storytelling wasn't a thing back then. In fact, people sort of used to laugh at storytelling in business. What the hell's that got to do with anything? But yeah, it certainly is a very, very popular thing now in corporates, which rightly so. It's a beautiful way to communicate. It's a more effective way to influence, connect with your customers and engage employees. So yeah, this is, every time I write a book, I think that's it. But this is my sixth book, and I truly believe the last one was going to be the last. But yeah, there's always stuff to write about as the landscape keeps moving a bit, and I keep seeing things that excite me or frustrate me or inspire me, so I want to write about it.
You see people making mistakes.
Absolutely. It's in fact, one of the catalysts for the books is I saw companies making so many mistakes, and you sort of think, I could write about it. And also I saw so many companies who had magical stories to share and weren't sharing them because they didn't think people would be interested or didn't understand the power. So that was pretty much the catalyst for the book. That's
fascinating. Yeah, you're doing so much, adding so much value. I could totally see that through just the evolution of social media and content marketing. It's amazing, these brands who have got these amazing stories of how they've become market leaders, or how they even started their journey, and none of their customers, they don't know these stories, and they're so they could just create such a connection with the brand, that level of authenticity and so on. So I'm fascinated by storytelling at the moment. Amber, first comment. Thanks for joining us from Cape Town. Amber's tuning in on Facebook. Who have we got on YouTube? Let us know in the chat what city you're coming from. And also my friends on LinkedIn. I know you're out there. Drop in the chat and say hello, guys. I know there's a little bit of a delay. Let us know where you're tuning in from. So tell us, how did you get into storytelling in the first place? Because you weren't always doing what you're doing today, were you?
No, absolutely not. I started my career, 35 years ago as a mainframe computer operator. So that's showing my age because I'm not even sure there's many companies that have mainframes. So as a trainee computer operator, and I sort of was in technology for about 10 years. And then I got more and more interested in leadership development. And so started doing that a bit. And then pretty much, it was probably about 20 years ago that I did start to notice the power of storytelling. I was in some senior leadership roles at NAB myself. I was in change management roles. And what I started to notice is when you shared stories, people not only understood the message better, but remembered it and connected with it. So I started looking around. There wasn't anyone doing it in Australia. There was someone in the States that had written a book on it. And I just, 16 years ago, I left NAB and thought, I think with my background around leadership, around change management, and around training leaders. And I thought, I reckon I could teach people how to do this. So that was sort of the premise 16 years ago. And it was a bit of a slow start, I must admit.
Was it?
Not everyone was buying storytelling 16 years ago, but they certainly are now.
So was it a immediate transition from NAB, or did you start doing some consulting or a bit of education while you were there?
Look, it was an immediate transition, but I guess in the last couple of years at NAB, I'd had 2 babies, so I'd sort of been in and out of maternity leave. So I was doing a little bit of consulting back to them and a little bit of just, I guess just casual work. But it was pretty much an immediate jump straight from NAB to teaching people how to do this. And when I say immediate, though, mind you, it took about 8 months to get a first client, and the first client was actually my ex-boss at National Australia Bank. And so I think, in fact, I was going through going through some really, really old files just this week, and I came across my very, very first proposal that I had sent to him. So he was a brilliant leader and a brilliant manager, and I think and a very supportive one. And I'm sure there was part of him that sort of thought, he'll throw me a bone and see and help me out.
That's awesome. Isn't that fascinating? That's so good. I'm just checking on LinkedIn that everything's working all right, because there seems to be a bit of a delay, but we have got lots of comments here. Rena's commented, Jermaine, and Joris, my man.
Joris, who's introduced us.
There's obviously a bit of delay. I expect what's going to happen is all the comments are going to pop up on the screen very shortly. But thanks very much for all your comments, guys. And as we go, feel free to jump in and join the conversation and ask questions in the chat as well. I'm sure there's a lot of questions that come up when it comes to storytelling. So this, I think that probably most of the stories that I've developed over the years have actually come from people just asking me questions. I think, I don't know how many of them now I probably find them a lot easier and come up with them a bit better. But how does a business owner who doesn't have experience creating content, isn't a speaker, doesn't do podcast interviews, where do they find stories that they can share, say, on their website or in their about page or with their customers?
Yeah. So it's a really great question. And first of all, as humans, we're hardwired to tell stories, and it's the way we communicate. And it's funny you said I only sort of tell stories when people ask me questions. It's because that's what we naturally do. Well, someone will ask us a question and we normally tell a story. We do that in the way we socialize, but we just tend not to do it so much in business. So the way the concept of the book and how I teach companies, and it doesn't matter how big your company is. You could be a big multinational, or you could just be a really small startup or an entrepreneur. I always first start with, well, what is the message you want to communicate? And the latest book, Magnetic Stories, is around brand storytelling. And to me is, well, what do you want your brand to be? So we all have a brand. As individuals, we have brand. As companies, we have brand. And it's taking control of that. So I love the quote from Jeff Bezos, who said, your brand is what people say about you when you're not in the room. My little tweak on that is it's the stories people share about you when you're not in the room. So I firstly say, what do you want those stories to be? What do you want your brand to be? If you want to be known for great customer service, then find stories around that. If you want to be known for integrity, find stories around that. If you want to be known as a risk taker, to find stories around that. So it starts off being clear what your brand is, and then just sort of almost, I can go into this deeper, but almost mining your life, going through and thinking about what stories you could use that would demonstrate the brand, that would amplify your brand. Yeah,
it's very interesting. I wonder where these comments are. It's not coming through on it's interesting.
We've got a little delay. That's all right.
There. I've seen them on LinkedIn.
Why don't I give you a great example of a story that I think really shows what like a magnetic story could do to help with your brand. And while I'm doing that, you can figure out how we get the comments.
I'm listening.
Oh,
in,
you're
listening.
Yeah. You're listening, and you've read the book, so this is in the book. So, to me, a story should demonstrate your values and what your brand is about. One of the greatest examples I shared in the book that I think, the reason it's in the book because it highlighted to me how powerful a story could be, was when I was growing up, I was a bit of a tomboy and I really wasn't into dolls. I never really played with dolls, and I never had a Barbie. And in the last couple of decades, when the story around Barbie has been a bad role model for girls and body shaming, I happily went along with that story. I've got two daughters who are now 17 and 20. I never bought them a Barbie. And in fact, I think I can remember telling people not to buy them a Barbie. I was so hell-bent on that. Researching for the book, I heard the backstory of Barbie, and it was Ruth Handler, who was the wife of one of the co-founders of Mattel. She noticed that when her two children, she had a son and a daughter. Her son was named Ken. Her daughter was named Barbie. And yes, Ken and Barbie were named after her children. But what she noticed in the 50s is when they were playing with their respective dolls, and they were sort of paper dolls back then, that the only thing Barbara could imagine herself as was a caregiver, where Ken was encouraged to see himself as an astronaut or a firefighter or a scientist. And so she pitched this idea of Barbie like a 3D plastic doll with fabric clothing. And they didn't like it initially, but she persisted. And so in 1959, Barbie debuted at the New York Toy Fair. And there's a quote from Ruth Handler that says, my whole philosophy with Barbie was that the little girl could be anything that she wanted to be. That Barbie, to me, always represented that a woman has choices. When I heard that story, when I heard the backstory, it completely changed my perception of the brand Barbie, and not only changed my perception of the brand, but will, potentially influence my future buying decisions around the product. So to me, that's a great example of what a story can do. It can help potential customers, really connect with the brand through that one story, and they're never going to forget the story, and they're going to actually retell the story, which is exactly what I do.
Yeah. And so where did you hear that story? Because it's not very widely known, is it?
No, it's and so Nathaniel, this is one of the reasons why I wrote the book too, because I see this as missed opportunity. So I heard a speaker talk very briefly about this story. She talked very briefly about it. And it's sort of because I was researching for the book, it sort of sparked my interest. So I researched it and I eventually found it, and it is on their website, but it's hidden. Like it's not front and center. And only because I was researching for the book did I keep searching for it. But I thought, what a missed opportunity. That story should be front and center on their website. That story should be on every Barbie doll packaging, because the message is as relevant as today as it was 60 years ago. But so it was a missed opportunity
around it that it could be eroded, couldn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And also there is a lot of stigma to it, but the amount of people, I just put that story in a blog post, the amount of people, and I was going to say women, but it was women and men, sort of my age, said, oh my God, I've completely changed my opinion of Barbie. So there's a whole generation. There's probably actually a whole couple of generations where that one story could change their perception of the brand.
Yeah, fascinating. And so, as you've been doing this for so many years, do you see that companies are facing the same sort of problems and roadblocks when it comes to storytelling, or has it changed in more recent years?
It's changed a little bit, as in, when I started doing this 15, 16 years ago, they weren't even using stories. They weren't even considering story to be, I guess, an effective or professional way to communicate. What I've noticed in the last few years, and more people are wanting to do brand storytelling, implement brand storytelling, but doing it, there's a few mistakes I see. First of all, I see them just producing a slick corporate video and thinking it's brand storytelling. And, it might be a beautifully a beautiful video, but it's not brand storytelling. Just calling something a story. So I see a lot of companies saying this is their story, but it's actually a timeline. It's not a story. A timeline is not. This happened, then that happened. It's a timeline, which is fine. Call it a timeline. There's a reason why that's called a timeline, because it's a timeline. It's not a story. And then the other thing I see is them just sharing one story. So I still have clients today come to me and say, can you help us develop our brand story? And I go, there is not one story that communicates your brand. So that the biggest mistake, they think it's one story.
Yeah.
Or maybe it's the story of how the company started, which could be a really good story. But to me, that's one of the potential 5 types of stories you should share. It's just one story. It's the creation story.
Yeah. Yeah. That was probably when I realized the power of storytelling to, the biggest magnitude is when I released a video about how I started my company. Like something that I wasn't, Marshall, don't play with the modem. We don't want any dramas with the connection. So something I wasn't comfortable sharing for many years, because I started my company in $20,000 in debt, getting evicted, no job, all this kind of stuff. And I hired this videographer, and he came and shot a whole bunch of content. I didn't really know what I was doing. And he asked me about this, how I started my company. And it was the first time I'd ever told this story, so it looks very authentic. There was lots of ums and ahs and, and the video, it did really well in terms of the engagement numbers. But what's most interesting is people, still mention to me, today that they've heard my founder story and related to it or resonated with them. This is like 5-6 years since, I've put that out there. People still remember that, but the chances of them remembering the 3 ways to get your profile to the top of,
they never will. And again, that's the power of it, because when we share a story, we're connecting, when people hear it, they're connecting on an emotional level. So first it makes them remember it. That's what it remembered. There's also and there's a huge amount of scientific neuroscience research that shows that that's what happens. The other thing that happens is that we create a connection to the storyteller. So I've heard your story. I not only remember the story, but there's this now connection with you. And a story like that shows a lot of vulnerability, and that's it. So vulnerability, sometimes we're reluctant to share those stories, but they're some of the most powerful ones, because that's what we all connect with, because we're all human. We're all human.
Yeah. And I think with what I do, social media, a lot of people think of vulnerability like, warning, sad post, and they're just going to share why they're so depressed, whereas
I think we'd lost you further that. Yeah. And look, that's, there's a lot of talk about vulnerability, but it's got to be authentic. I mean, God, we see this with our politicians at the moment that are doing empathy training. And I was like, oh my God. And and then something happens where they show a little bit of empathy or vulnerability or tear up, and people just don't consider it authentic. There's a great
Paul's got a question here.
Paul, yeah.
On YouTube. Paul's over in England. So
excellent
morning, Paul.
Over
there.
So how do you know what stories will appeal to your potential clients? Look, I think what I talk about is, if you're sharing stories around your values and what's important to you, it'll appeal to a certain amount of people. It won't appeal to everyone, but if it's what's important to you, and it's especially around your values, what it will appeal to is the clients that you want, or the tribe you want. So this is why the authenticity is really important, because you don't want to be sharing stories that aren't authentic, because they might appeal to potential clients, but they're not your clients. So just, right. I always remember, like, some people sort of go, oh, would story work on this audience, or would story work with this? If your audience is human, they will connect with stories. They might not connect with every single story, but they will connect with stories, because it's in our DNA, it's in our nature to tell stories and listen to stories. It's the way we communicate. So, I don't think, I think would be madness to think that every story you put out there will connect with every, one of your potential clients. And that's sort of the idea, is you put out a variety. In the book, I talk about the 5 different types of stories. It's not 5 stories, it's 5 different types of stories. So it's how you constantly put stories out there.
Yeah. Yeah. And they get better the more you tell them, as the more you practice them. And which leads me to my next question, which is, that is something that I've noticed as well, is like when somebody, tries to share a story, there's always, normally it's right at the start, but it's like, I was working in this job and then I got a promotion and then I met my wife. But before that, there's all this, like, this happened, then this happened, this happened. And then, then they kind of get into it. How do you make a story brief if you haven't had experience doing so?
Yeah, look, and there's a skill. Look, if storytelling was easy, if storytelling, if there was no skill involved and we could all just do it, it'd be fair to say I wouldn't have a job. What I do is I teach people how to do it more effectively. One of the things, and you do have to be short, and you have got to be short and sharp. So my sort of guide is around about 2 minutes, depending on sort of where you're at. But but Nathaniel, one of the things you just spoke about too is some people will say, I did this and I did that, and then I met my wife, and then they start their story, and so a lot of the feedback is, okay, the story started here. So how do you take that 90 seconds it took to get you to that point? How do you get there in 5 seconds? So, and normally all the lead up to that is irrelevant. They don't need it. I sort of think you just start your stories with almost time and place. So, I grew up as one of 8 children. Like can you see how that sets context? I don't need to go in. I don't need to sort of say where I grew up or what people go. I grew up, there was 8 children. My mum did this. My dad did. You just got to get one sentence should get you into your story, and automatically that signals to your audience that you're about to tell them a story. So they're actually now listening and they're engaged. Yeah.
Yeah. I think I did these, live events for so many years, and I'd watch the playback, and then I'd realize, hey, those 10 minutes are not relevant to the story. I could chop those a bit out.
Yeah. I think one of the things I teach people is be really clear on the one message you want to get across with your story. So just whether it's one of your company values or why you started, or it's one message. And once you're clear on that message, then you've got to constantly going, is that bit relevant to the message? If it's not, you just sort of leave it out. I mean, we've talked a bit about a founder story, like how the company created. I've almost got several versions of that, depending on whether it's, I'm doing a 1-day training workshop, that story could be a bit longer. If I'm doing a 10-minute presentation, it's got to be shorter. If I'm on a panel, so you sort of got different variations of the same story.
Yeah. And like if some people, when they speak from stage, they use storytelling to transfer the audience from maybe like an emotional state of uncertainty or fear, or one of those sort of anxious states, to one of empowerment, and they sort of base the story around moving them from one emotional state to the other. Is that something that you use in your framework? And if so, like, how do you, because I think from what I understand, it's way more important to like describe in detail how you felt during, when the challenge arose, or, rather than, the events. Can you just talk a little bit about that side of things?
Yeah. And so a couple of things. It's, to me, storytelling is like a day-to-day communication and influencing skill. So yes, if you're doing presentations, use it for that, but you could use it in any aspect of your business and in any format. But you're right. It's not, if you need, when you're sharing a story, and especially perhaps say you want to inspire people or motivate people to do something, as opposed to saying, okay, so we had this problem and we did this and then we did that and we tried this and this was the outcome. that will tend to be a bit of a case study where it's just information. Where what I say to people is like, someone will share a story and then I'll say to them, so how did you feel when that happened? And they would go, oh my God, I felt so proud. I was so proud we were able to do that. I felt blah, blah, blah. And I go, because, that should be in the story. Like, and it's, as opposed to this was the great outcome, focus more on the hardship, the challenge, what you learned from that. Like what's the most valuable thing you learned from that? And that then makes it a really powerful story.
Yeah. And do the stories differ in structure or length depending on the medium that you're communicating on? Like if it's in a written format or social media or a live event? Does it? Yeah,
they do. And look, I think as a rule of thumb, I think the shorter, the better.
It's very difficult. That's the hardest part, isn't it?
It is. Yeah. It absolutely is the hardest part. But the point is, you want to engage your audience, and if you're writing a really long story or you're telling a really long story, it's almost you're not disciplined, and your storytelling becomes about you as opposed to the audience. So you do have to prepare, and you got to put a lot of effort into making your short stories are succinct. Who was the famous writer who said, "Apologies for the long letter. I didn't have time to write a short one."
Short one, yeah.
Was it Orson Welles or Oscar? Someone like that. So you've got to put a lot of time and effort into making your story succinct. But I'm a fan of Alan Joyce. So Alan Joyce, the CEO of Qantas. When I used to get on planes, I used to read the Qantas magazine, and there was always a letter from the CEO, and he was really good at sharing stories. But his stories could be like literally one sentence. And in a paragraph, he could almost share stories about, I remember he was talking about one of the things he loves about being CEO of Qantas is that when he meets people, when they tell him about the great customer service that they received. And he literally just cited 3 examples, of an air hostie opening up a bag of pretzels for a customer because they noticed that she had a broken arm and her arm was in plaster and couldn't do it.
Yeah.
And so it's literally the story was a sentence. So I think depending on the format, whether it's, if it's your founder story on your website, it could be pretty short. It could be in the written format or on a video. If you're sharing stories on social media, they could be in the written format or on a video. Yeah. But I think if it's a video, you probably want to be about a minute, maybe maybe 90 seconds.
It's a great place to practice, isn't it?
It's a brilliant place to practice. Brilliant place to practice. And
Richard Branson's very good at it, isn't he?
Richard Branson's a great storyteller. So he's really good at sharing stories.
Fantastic.
Yeah, he's one of the really good ones. But
he's the most followed person on LinkedIn. So that's probably got something to do with it.
Yeah, because when he communicates, it's engaging. He sort of talks from the heart. But and it's all about just finding a really nice variety of stories that you can share, and they don't all have to be about you. Make them about your customers, make them about your employees. But overall, what you're trying to do is you're trying to communicate your brand. If it's brand storytelling you're doing, or you're trying to, as an individual, you're trying to communicate a message better.
Yeah. Very interesting, guys. This is. I'm going to hop on LinkedIn here. I know you've probably been asking tons of questions. Let's have a look here. We're getting a lot of positive feedback, just so you.
Well, that's good.
You're very inspiring. Melbourne, everyone wants to know if Marshall's ruining the connection. What are the 5 main focus points at a high level? Jermaine's asked. And Paola's asked, should one's stories always have a concrete purpose?
I think in business you need to have like a purpose while you're sharing the story. So like what's the point? What's the message? Because you don't want to be sharing a story in a business setting. So whether it's a presentation or a meeting or on your website or in a newsletter, and people read the story and just go, and what? Like, what was the point of that? So I think you do need to have a clear message, or it's just communicating the overall vibe of the brand. what was the other question about the 5 something?
Yeah, I was a bit might need a bit more clarification on that one. Jermaine said at a high level, what are the 5 main focus points? So I'm just seeing if he made another comment.
Yeah, okay, maybe that might be a good opportunity, because I mentioned the 5 types of stories, so maybe they were referring to that. So I will talk about that.
Sense.
So so I think as a company, even as an individual, really, you want to be looking for 5 types of stories you could share, and one is the creation story. So that's either how the company started or how a product started. And the reason so we normally call this the founder story is what it's normally called, but the founder story is normally only about how the company started, where I think the creation story sort of brings together how the company started or how a product started. So the Barbie story I just shared before is a classic example of a creation story around the product. The story that you share about how you started this, $20,000 in debt, would be a classic story of how the company started. So they're creation stories. The other type of story is the culture story. They all start with C's too, by the way. It's very, very clever. Very creative, very clever and creative.
Creative and clever.
And consistent. There's another C word.
There we go. Cool. So
the culture story. So the culture story is pretty much that is your brand. So what do you want to be known for? If you want to be known for great customer service, then share stories about customer service. Share stories about your employees delivering exceptional customer service. So that's around the culture stories, which to me, culture is your values and your behaviors. That's your culture. Yeah. So how do you share stories about that? And how do your leaders, if you're a bigger company, how do your individual leaders share personal stories about the values? The other one is customer stories. So how can you share stories about your customers? And it's not just necessarily about how your customers, have benefited from your product or service. So we want to move away from testimonials, but it's almost like make your customers the heroes of the story. There's I'll mention the other 2 quickly, and I'll come back to a great customer story. There's community stories. So that's a similar thing. What are you doing in your community? And again, this is just moving away from you bragging about your corporate responsibility stuff, but again, make your employees the heroes. You could have an employee that just works, for the life-saving club or something, share stories about them, about the good things that they're doing in their community, not necessarily the company. And then the other story is challenge stories. So how have you responded to challenges, both big or small? What have you done? Because normally that would demonstrate your values as well, and it could also demonstrate your community spirit. So I'll give you a great example of a customer story. One of the things I loved writing this book is I got to speak to so many companies from around the world that were just doing amazing things with storytelling. And one of them was the Columbia restaurant in Florida, which is a 5th generational owned restaurant in Florida in the US. And it's the oldest restaurant in Florida. And they've been so committed to storytelling, like for so long, that in fact, it was in 1942, they hired a journalist to write a newspaper article every day. And it was they called it Characters of Columbia. So it was stories about their customers, the barman that had worked there for 20 years, all this type of stuff. But last Valentine's Day on social media, they put on their social media, on Facebook, they put it on, about a couple who had been celebrating their wedding anniversary at the Columbia restaurant for 72 years. And it was, this couple went to the restaurant on their first wedding anniversary, and they came back the next year and coincidentally got the same table. And for then the next 70 years, Columbia Restaurant has reserved that table for them. And they sort of said, the ultimate lovebirds, happy Valentine's Day. So they're just completely sharing a story about the customer, but by default you're going, that's a pretty cool thing that they're doing. You never hear that
from restaurants, do you? And they probably hear loads of stories.
Yeah, and you just think that, God, that must be a really special restaurant that's what that couple's doing. So, I mean, subtly, it sort of playing in the restaurant, but it's just making the customer the hero.
Yeah, I did a post once. I was involved in a it was a crowdfunding campaign. Basically, that they made e-bikes, and within 6 weeks, he wanted to raise $1 million. This startup founder, and I met him. He got introduced through a digital agency, and I said, "You must be crazy, right?" But I said, "We'll do the LinkedIn component," and sure enough, within 6 weeks, he'd raised $1 million. Now, like it was not like LinkedIn was part of it, but there was a whole lot of other stuff going on as well. And I remember he, was celebrating, and he invited us and the other digital agency that was involved down to his house for a few drinks. And I thought, oh, while we're here, let's get a photograph together celebrating. And I just put a post up on the way home saying, when Julian came into my my world, I said, you must be crazy if you think you could raise $1 million in 6 weeks. But, lo and behold, we did it. This is what, success, I don't know. So it was like bigging him up and saying, congratulations, well done, and then and I didn't really say anything about my involvement at all, mainly because I wasn't, fully responsible. It was just a part of it. But the amount of private messages I got on LinkedIn from companies that wanted to raise money.
Yeah. It's a great example.
Mention anything about me. Yeah.
So you're sharing the story, make the customer your hero. People, I think the biggest mistake, then people go, and we help them with blah 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 blah. You just don't need to do it, because then you're exactly right. It ruins it, because it goes from a nice story to now sounding like a sales pitch, and it just ruins it. So just
yeah,
people will get
it. I think praising people on social media does so well. If there's something that you notice in your team members, or even the local cafe, the local barista, and you can say some positive things about them, it does wonders for showing your character. But then you're right, and you say you could big up an employee, and you can say. And you can say, obviously that's a result of our training programs and blah, 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 and then you just
lost it. But yeah, if you're highlighting one of your customers for doing sensational customer service, and they did this, and you're just literally saying, we're really proud of that, by default, everyone knows, well, clearly that's a value you have. Clearly it's a behavior that you recognize and reward. And so they see that, and you know what? And then all your other employees are going, oh wow, they're looking for opportunities to demonstrate that behaviour.
Yeah, and then so they start looking for these stories to share as well.
Yeah. Well, they're looking for opportunities to create those stories.
Wow.
Which is the cool thing, and this is where we get this this cyclical thing of finding a story, sharing it, which will then inspire other people to do something similar, which creates stories, and that's when you get the real culture change.
Wow.
So it's sort of like, if you want to be known for customer service, yes, share stories about doing customer service, but actually do customer service. You can't just share stories about customer service and then be crap at it. You've actually got to do it as well.
Yeah. Normally when a company starts taking their social media seriously, they draw up a policy about all the things you're not allowed to do, as opposed to, inspiring them to do. I never thought of the storytelling aspect to getting employees to be more active on social media, because it's a huge challenge for a lot of these big companies, because most of these employees are scared to say the wrong thing, etc.
It's fascinating. One of the things I talk about is, when it comes to brand storytelling, it's not just the marketing department, it's not just the comms. It's like everyone, it's every single employee, because every single employee's got this opportunity to not only share a story, but to do something that creates stories. So you've got to educate them about that, but then you've got to empower them. You can't say, oh, share stories, but you're not allowed to do this, you're not allowed to do that. And you've got to run it by, corporate affairs and legal every time you share it, because no one's going to do it. So you just got to trust people.
Yeah. And so are there other instances where you might use storytelling other than, creating content and speaking from stage?
Yeah, look, there was a great example I came across, again, researching for the book around, and this is Archie Rose, the gin distillery in Sydney. So they're a relatively small company. I think they're a young company, rather. They started in 2014. When we went into lockdown, we went into lockdown in March. They were a small company, but they had a bar attached to their distillery. So because they had to close down the bar, they were really concerned that the 15 bar staff would lose their job. So they immediately made the decision to switch from making gin to making hand sanitizer. And when I say immediately, within 3 days, they had produced 7,500 bottles of hand sanitizer. So completely changing their production line and designing and printing labels and doing all that. And they went on to make over 120,000 bottles and not only save 15 of their staff, but could actually employ another 15 people from locally that had lost their job because they're in the hospitality industry. Now so first of all, their values are around innovation and quality. And when I spoke to the head of marketing, they said because they live and breathe those values, they knew they could do this. There was no doubt in their mind that they could do it because they had such strong values around innovation and quality. So it sort of demonstrated the values. It demonstrated their commitment to not only their employees, but, I guess the broader community of the people around them that had lost their jobs. That story gained like worldwide attention. And when I was speaking to the head of marketing, she sort of said that they doubled their database within a few months. That story had meant they doubled their database and increased their brand awareness by about 12 to, she thought about 12 to 18 months of where they would have been. Their social media interaction increased by 30%, all this type of stuff. And, so she said, we didn't do it to create the story. We did it because that's who we are and that's what we did. Yeah. But then they realized the power of the story. So they started to share it more, and it is on their website, and every time you hear her speak, you will hear that story being shared. So it's sort of almost proactively finding ways to share the story.
Yeah. When you obviously you'd probably absorb a lot of content from all over the place that are related to storytelling. Do you take much from the world of movies and entertainment?
No, I don't actually. And I say that really quickly because one of the reasons why people in business are reluctant to share stories is for several reasons. They sort of think, well, my story is just pretty normal. It's nothing like, it's not Hollywood. And I go, no, It's not Hollywood. This isn't Hollywood. So, and it's also, Hollywood's making a 2-hour movie. It's not as relatable. So I don't. I sort of go, and in fact, in all my training, I always say, this is not Hollywood. Okay, it's think of your most day-to-day stories. They're the ones that people relate to. The more sort of just human or down to earth your stories are the ones people will relate to.
Yeah, I'm curious. Have you ever heard of the significant object study?
No, I haven't. Tell me about that.
So you'd be interested in that. So there was this study done where they bought 200 objects from eBay for an average price of $1 each. Things like ornaments, horses' heads. And then they asked 200 authors to volunteer and write a story about each one of these objects. And then they resold them on eBay for around $6,000 or something. Yeah, 200 objects to demonstrate the power of storytelling. Yeah,
it's
come across this?
I haven't. I will look into it, but that's exactly what it will do. It's sort of part of there's a chapter in the book around heritage over history and we talk about like you could have an object, but without the backstory, it actually doesn't mean anything. And I talk, my father passed away about 18 months ago, and I remember going through some of his stuff. Thank you, but he was old. Thank God it was before COVID. He'd have things like that would, an old set of screwdrivers where Mum would go, oh, we'll just throw these out. And we'd go, no, don't throw them out because I remember Dad taught me this. And so, but it was only through the story that had value to it. And And so it would be really valuable to one of us, but not valued to the others, because there wasn't the story there, and it wasn't the story that they attached to it. So, you add a backstory to anything, it will increase the value of. And I'm not just talking about the monetary value of an object. It will help people connect with it.
Yeah, it makes total sense to me. So, so you work primarily with corporate, like larger companies, don't you? Can you tell me a little bit about what services you offer?
Yeah, so I mean, it's pretty much small to medium enterprises to larger corporates. Okay. I predominantly train their leaders on how to share stories more effectively. So normally it's companies will bring me in when they're going through change and they want to communicate that more effectively through stories, or they've got new values or behaviors that they want to then communicate through stories. Now, that's typically your larger organizations that sort of do that, but more and more, and especially with content of the new book, it was like, how do we sort of know what our brand is, and therefore how do we find these stories, and how do we start sharing them? One of the case studies I did in the book was actually with a client. It's a relatively small client I've been working with for about 3 or 4 years. They're an investment company in Vietnam, so they're Mekong Capital. Okay. And I just worked with their leadership team. They're not a huge company, but they wanted to start to find stories. They had a goal of finding 100 stories over a year. And I went and worked with them for 3 days. And by the end of the 3 days, we'd already had 60 stories. And within a few months, they'd hit their 100, and they're now well over 400 stories. And they communicate them internally in their induction programs, externally with their stakeholders. It's all over their social media. It is such a great case study of implementing brand storytelling really, really well to great effect.
So I was going to ask you how long an engagement normally takes, but it sounds like it's a lot quicker than I would have expected.
Yeah, it can be. It can simply be, I can come in and do a half-day training workshop and shift, at least teach people how to share stories more effectively, through to longer, that work with the Mekong Capital was, it was probably about over a year I did the work with them.
Okay.
But it really just depends. Sometimes companies just go, I just want to get better at telling stories. That's all we need, and that's fine. It's just a pure come in and train, where others have got a more strategic outcome in mind, and it's a longer engagement. But yeah. I just got one more question, or I'll have a quick look, see if any of the audience has asked any more questions on LinkedIn. But I've got a bit of a selfish question, to be honest. I tend to do this when I'm interviewing people, because you've obviously published this one's published by, I'm pronouncing it right? Wiley, yeah.
Yeah. So have you done any self-publishing, or you published them all through publishers?
I've published them all except one. So that's my 6th book. So that's my 5th book through Wiley. I've got a little collection here. I wrote this really short book called Storytelling for Job Interviews, and it's really tiny. It's only about 8,000 words, and it's just too small for Wiley to publish it. So I published it. I self-published. But yeah, I'm a big fan of going through a publisher.
So did you approach them, or did they approach you?
I approached them the first time. So the first book I wrote was probably about 8-9 years ago. And then we've just got the partnership where we now every couple of years we sort of go, what's next? Or they go, what's next? Or I go, what's next? And
that's awesome.
See what happens. Yeah. But it's to me as a
sort of profession, isn't it?
It is. Publishing books is it's a very skilled profession too. So part of me in writing a book is I want to get it out to as many people as possible. And through going through a publisher, they really take control of the distribution. So, when you're talking about global distribution, it's pretty hard to do that when you're self-publishing.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I've written I guess I've written a book really. But then I think when I'm like looking at self-publishing, I'm like, I don't really know anything about this. I'm going to be, I'm not focusing on my strengths here. So I was just curious from a selfish perspective. You've obviously done extremely well. And I think that the book is absolutely fantastic. You're great at telling stories, and you've obviously partnered with somebody that's a company that's good at distributing them.
Yeah, know what your strengths are and know what your weaknesses are. That's for sure.
Yeah. I was like, what am I doing? I'm not.
Yeah, I know. You know what? I actually failed English in my final year of school, so I wouldn't say writing is a strength of mine either. But
really?
I actually found a style that worked for me.
Yeah.
Like I write,
conversational style?
Yeah, and I write how I talk. And in fact, the biggest compliment I can get from anyone, like, oh my God, I felt like you were just in the room talking to me. So I know I'm good at that type of writing.
That's very rare.
I also know I have to get very good editors around me too.
Yeah, okay. It's good advice.
And a very good editor that doesn't lose my voice, because you can have a good editor that will edit it so much that it's just not your voice. So again, I've used the same editor most of the time, and she knows how I work and I know how she works, and she edits enough not to remove my voice from the book.
And so how did you find that particular editor?
Yeah, that was actually, I was actually in a co-working space, and I put the call out, and she just happened. She was doing a bit of editing, but not book editing, and I was literally her first client, and so
wow.
We've now been working together for about 8 years, so we know how each other works really well now.
That's awesome. There's a bunch of questions, but then like a lot of them have been answered in our conversation. So I'm glad we're on the same frame of mind.
Yeah.
What happened with the comments this week? It's been a little bit strange with this technology business.
Yes. Well, you know what happens with technology. It's wonderful when it works.
Yeah. So you've been doing a lot of virtual workshops and so on in the last year? Yeah.
So, I've predominantly always would do face-to-face training, but in the last year we've just switched to virtual, and I've been really surprised how well it's worked.
In fact, you're very good on the camera.
Yeah, I've had clients tell me that it's been the most interactive, engaging training they've done, and that's including face-to-face. So what it actually meant was I was actually able to run a couple of public workshops virtually, and normally I'd run public workshops in the past, but I'd literally run them in Melbourne and Sydney and maybe Canberra, and that's about it. But because I ran them virtually, I had people from all over the world joining in. So I've actually just the other week scheduled 3 more workshops, and one actually at the request of a lot of my Asian and European clients to run it at a time that's a lot more friendlier for them. So 9 p.m. start for me, but a really good time for Asia and in Europe. But there's other ones that are 9:30 a.m. so they're better as well.
Interesting. Okay, well, we're approaching an hour, so we're going to have to call it a night, guys. Magnetic Stories is a fantastic book. Is this the best place for people to start if they want to learn more and dive a bit deeper into what you do?
Yeah, I think so, because I think what it will do is it'll just inspire them. What I love about this book, I hope it gives people enough information why storytelling works, a lot of case studies to see how they could do it, but I think most importantly inspires them, that say, well, let's give it a crack. And if it's something you're interested in, then there's a lot of free stuff on my website and, all that type of stuff.
Yeah, I think one of the things that drew me into it is the variety of the different examples that you use to demonstrate certain points. But so you kind of, how some books, they just sort of go over the same thing over and over again, and you sort of get halfway through and you're like, okay, I get it. I found that this sort of kept me, I like that Barbie story.
Yeah.
I've already retold that a few times.
Yeah. And I think so. First of all, I don't think I've ever read an entire business book, because I agree. You get about halfway through and you're okay. I've got the point now. I think you just repeated yourself.
I know we're going to admit that.
Yeah. I think the content in this book, because it's all stories,
yes,
and it is written in a way you could go cover to cover if you wanted to, but you could just dip in and out to literally any place you want and read that. And yeah, there's a lot of very, very cool stories in there.
So where's the best place to get it? Is it Amazon or on your website?
Any of the, Amazon, Booktopia, all Dimmicks, all the online stores and all the in-person stores, it's all there. But yeah, if you go to my website, it will give you a list of all the places you can get it. But
awesome.
all the usual ones.
You're in the bookstores at the airport, and
so it's actually I'm pretty glad things have started to open up. So it's currently pick of the month in the bookstores.
Wow!
In the airport bookstores, and I think there's a few pictures of me, billboards around of me lately in the airport. So if you're traveling, which is exciting anyway. Have you been on a plane yet? Everyone's so excited. You sit on a plane and everyone's just like so excited.
Yeah, I'm moving house over the next week, so I'm going to do it after that. But I'm a little bit anxious. It's been a while since I've been on a plane.
Yeah, I was on a plane a couple of weeks ago. It's been about 3 times now, and this couple walked in, and they then got separated, and the guy sat next to me, and what I assumed was his partner or wife sat in the other seat. And I sort of said, when we take off, I'm happy to swap if you want to sit next to your partner. And he went, no, it's my wife. He goes, we've been stuck both working from home for 12 months. This is our first trip. And he just didn't stop talking. We were talking, and I could hear his wife talking. Everyone was so chatty. It was so good.
Yeah, that's awesome. I guess it becomes exciting again when you haven't done it for a while. It
does. It becomes very, very exciting.
Well, look, thanks so much for taking the time. I know it's late over there in Melbourne. You're in Melbourne, aren't you?
Yeah, I'm Melbourne. Yeah.
Yeah, that's where I'll be going in a couple of weeks. But thanks very much for your time. I really do appreciate it. It's been a pleasure talking to you and learning a bit more about your story. And we'll hop onto the links on LinkedIn and YouTube and Facebook and see if there's anything that we've missed. But and address any of those questions that we may not have got to. But guys, check out Magnetic Stories and have a fantastic week in business. That is a wrap. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks.